We don't want that kind of extremist agenda and just say no. So I think that if we send the right messages through the legislative work we do, get the economy stabilized and on the right track again, people will say, I want to vote with the folks who are on my side.
You're going to be playing a lot of defense next year in these elections, considering that you have 258 seats now in the House, which is the same number eerily that Democrats had at this point in 1993, before they lost their majority last time in 1994. But in the Democracy Corps survey that was taken in October, the pollsters also surveyed the districts of 15 Democratic veterans, not only freshmen and sophomore Democrats, but veterans, whose re-elect scores were well below 50%. In other words, 43% of voters said that they would re-elect them next year. You've said in the past that these members are aware of the challenges that they're going to face next year and that they're preparing actively. But what is your committee doing to lay the groundwork for competitive races in their districts?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are going to be politically choppy waters out there. We've already seen some signs of it, although I will say that many of the polls and surveys we've looked at show things have improved somewhat since August, when it was really choppy weather out there. But I agree with the premise, which is this is going to be a tough cycle, not just for new members, but for many of our other members from some of these more moderate districts. What are we doing? We are working with many of them just as we're working with our frontline program. We are making sure that their campaign operations are getting up and running early, that they're bringing people on board, that they've got their grassroots operation up and ready to go, that they've got their campaign email lists. And I should say we're continuing to work with them on the official side, just making sure that they're doing the things that every new member of Congress does when they want to make sure they connect with their constituents.
And to make sure they don't retire.
Well, that's true. And we at least so far, knock on wood, have been successful in limiting retirement. So you don't see nearly as many Democratic retirements this time as you saw in 1994. Look, I should just say on 1994, I said at the outset here, this is going to be a tough competitive election cycle. But I do not believe in the doomsday scenarios. So far, fewer retirements. We're staying on offense. We did not do that in 1994. And at least as of right now, the confidence of the voters in the Republican Party is at an all-time low because they're not providing any answers. They're not providing pragmatic solutions. They are become ideologues, just as we saw in New York 23, where they imposed a purity test and drove their candidate out of the race.
We haven't seen a party switch in a while in the House. And usually after a party takes control, there's a little bit of that rearranging that goes on. In 1995, you saw some Democrats turn Republican. Democrats have won big victories the last two elections. Is there anybody that you're focused on trying to recruit to your side? Are you even making those efforts or overtures to moderate Republicans to say, hey, don't just leave Congress because some of them are doing that, come over to our side?
I've had those conversations with members of the other side from time to time. Sometimes they're just joking, and you're hoping maybe you'll be kidding around. They'll say, "Hey, I am interested," but so I mean, those conversations have gone on both on a serious basis and a not so serious basis. But as you mentioned, I mean, no one right now is thinking of changing sides that I know of anyway. I mean, there may always be something someone's thinking that we're not aware of.
If I could piggyback real fast on Jonathan's question, it seems as if a lot of the moderate Republicans who were left in the House before 2006 are no longer here. Right. Who are some moderate House Republicans who you still admire?
Well, look, there are lots of people I admire, moderates and conservatives, as individuals who stand up for what they believe in. But you're right with respect to the shrinking number of moderates. I mean, at one point, the moderates were an endangered species in the Republican Party. Now they are virtually extinct in the House. You've got Mark Kirk. He's running for Senate. You've got Mike Castle. He's running for Senate. You've got Jim Gerlach running for other office. Those who were some of the moderate members in the Republican constellation in the House are mostly moving on. And I do think that reflects the problem the Republicans have. And I would think that if you were looking forward as a Republican Party, you would want to try and build a bigger tent. And in fact, what they're doing instead of building a larger tent is they're shrinking the tent. I think right now they got a little pup tent, and the people who are leading the charge for them are the Rush Limbaughs of the world and the right-wing talk show hosts of the world.
Do you want to make any predictions for next year?
I do not want to make any predictions because it's still way too early. It will be a competitive cycle. We know that from a historical perspective, we got a headwind. On the other hand, we are working very hard to try and implement the agenda that the President talked about, focusing first on getting the economy going, trying to pass a decent health care reform through the entire process and get a bill to the President's desk. While on the other hand, you've got Republicans voting no, 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 and hell no. So I don't think that no is a responsible answer to the problems that the American people are experiencing. And I think that's why they have such trouble in terms of the polling that shows such small confidence in them right now.
Congressman Chris Van Hollen, thanks for joining us on Newsmakers.
Good to be with you. Good to be with you.
We continue the conversation with David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report and Jonathan Allen of Politico. Let me go back to something that Congressman Van Hollen said in terms of being on offense. The Democrats lost 54 seats in 1994. The Republicans lost 27 seats in 1982. What do the Democrats need to do that they didn't do in 94 or the Republicans didn't do in 82?
Well, I think one of the big differences, certainly with 94 for the Democrats, is that I think a lot of Democrats were taken by surprise in 1994. I think they didn't know that they were going to have a tough election until right before it. Remember, they'd been in control for 40 years. So this is a Democratic Party heading into this election that is aware that, as Congressman Van Hollen said, they're heading into a headwind. And that it's probably a cycle where they'll lose some seats. He didn't want to say that, but I think that's the conventional wisdom. There aren't a lot of places where they're going to win Republican seats, because they've won most of those winnable seats over the last two cycles. So I think when he's talking about being on offense, it's not so much being on offense to win Republican-held seats. It's more on offense in terms of message, in terms of moving the Democratic agenda, and in terms of being able to tell voters that they have solutions to their everyday problems, rather than going before them and not having done those things.
What races are you watching?
Well, at least economically, to speak to what you asked before, this election cycle looks a little bit more like 1982 than 1994. But we're watching races all over the country right now. In particular, I think the most telling map in House politics right now is the map of places where President Obama did worse than John Kerry in 2008. And if you take a look at that red swath from eastern Oklahoma all the way up to western Pennsylvania, there are Democratic veterans in the House there that may face tougher races than Democratic freshmen and sophomores who were elected from better districts in 2006 and 2008. So if I were Democrats right there, I would be pretty cautious about those districts and prepare very early for those fights. The one thing that I think is encouraging to Democrats is that Republicans don't just need 41 seats to take back the House. In actuality, they probably need closer to 45, because Democrats will probably pick up a seat here or there in Louisiana. Joseph Gow, the Republican elected in a fluke in 2008, is probably an underdog for re-election. Democrats have a couple of open seat opportunities in Pennsylvania, Illinois, Delaware. And so Democrats are going to be able to have a tiny bit of offense to offset whatever they lose, which could be substantial.
And finally, do the ethics investigations, let's just focus on the Democrats, John Murtha of Pennsylvania, Charlie Rangel of New York, do these issues affect how the Democrats approach 2010? Because they were an issue in past midterm elections.
I think it's going to depend a lot on what happens over the next year with the Ethics Committee and with federal investigations that are going on into some of these matters, as to whether it looks like Nancy Pelosi is fulfilling her promise to drain the swamp. That is, these guys are being caught for things if they're doing them and thrown out or punished in some way, or if these continue to just sort of hang out there, or in some cases maybe people will be found to have done something wrong and stay in their seats, which would be kind of a worst-case scenario for the Speaker. So I think it matters a lot what happens in each of these cases.
Well, timing is everything with these ethics investigations, isn't it? And when you take a look at the Democrats who are under investigation, not a lot of them could potentially face races of their own. But what I think it does is it sets the tone for 2010, much as Republican scandal in 2006 set the tone for 2006. and it ties back to Speaker Pelosi more than it does to President Obama. And to the extent that Republicans are on the upswing because President Obama's brand is a little bit lower than it might have been in 2008, they're hoping that that Democrats' standing is even worse because Speaker Pelosi's brand and the Democratic congressional brand is even lower than President Obama's. And so I think these ethics investigations tie back to that congressional Democratic brand and hurt Democrats.
David Wasserman, Jonathan Allen, thanks for joining us here on C-SPAN.
Thank you, Steve.